Late one autumn night, a man named Everett drove down a lonely stretch of highway just outside his hometown. The moon was hidden behind rolling clouds, and the only light came from his sputtering headlights. As he rounded a bend, a strange fog crept across the road, dense, silvery, and swirling in a way fog shouldn't. There was no going around it, so he gripped the wheel, braced himself, and drove in. For a few seconds, the fog pressed against every window, obscuring all vision. The air felt cold and static, making Everett's hair stand on end. He had the unsettling sensation of motion, as if his car was not just moving forward, but somehow spinning in place. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the fog cleared. Still trembling, Everett looked around in confusion. The road remained the same, but it looked different. The tall pines were smaller, the roadside signage looked older, like something out of a black and white film. Spooked, but determined, he pressed on toward the familiar lights of his town. He found himself in the same place he had always called home, but something was off. The buildings bore old-fashioned signs, and the streets were dotted with classic cars that belonged more in a museum than on a modern road. People stopped to stare at Everett's car as he passed, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. His clothes, jeans and a modern leather jacket, seemed like something from another planet. Shaken, Everett headed for the local police station, hoping for help. The station, too, was as it had once been, stark, cramped, and filled with vintage equipment. When he stepped inside, an even greater shock awaited him. At the dispatcher's desk sat his grandmother, but decades younger than he had ever known her. She wore a conservative dress, her hair pinned in curls around her head, and she eyed Everett with a mixture of suspicion and alarm. He struggled to steady his voice as he introduced himself. I'm your grandson," he stammered. "It's 57 years in the future where I come from. Something happened on the highway. I ended up back here." She turned pale. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Who are you? How do you know me?" Desperate to convince her, Everett recounted details from her life, her favorite music, the little house she grew up in, how she would someday inherit a ring from her mother. With every personal detail he revealed, she only looked more terrified. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Instead of finding empathy, Everett found panic. The officers, unsure how to make sense of his stories, or his strange vehicle, handcuffed him and dragged him to a cramped interrogation room. Days turned into weeks, while the local authorities wrestled with Everett's odd case. The police didn't know what to do with his futuristic car, so they towed it to an impound lot and stored it under a dusty tarp. Newspapers printed sensational headlines. "Strange man appears in mysterious automobile." Yet most dismissed Everett as a madman. The local psychiatrist, Dr. Langley, was called in to evaluate Everett. Convinced that the young man was dangerously delusional, Dr. Langley recommended that Everett be committed to a mental hospital for the public's safety. There, locked behind heavy doors and white-walled hallways, he was subjected to countless interviews, examinations, and eventually, with no one to believe him, a brutal lobotomy. He slipped into a silent, foggy existence, his mind drifting between scattered memories and vacant stares. In the meantime, Dr. Langley became a frequent visitor to the police station under the guise of checking on the investigation. He was intrigued by the case, but he was more intrigued by the kind, soft-spoken dispatcher, Everett's grandmother. Over the following months, their relationship blossomed. She was drawn to his educated manner, and he to her gentle spirit. They began dating, though her fears about that strange traveller lingered in her mind. Years passed. Dr. Langley and Everett's grandmother married and had a daughter. Life moved on. The mystery of the time traveller with the bizarre vehicle faded into local lore, talked about occasionally at the corner diner or among the older police officers. The curious car remained tucked away in storage, collecting dust and rumours. One crisp morning, Dr. Langley sat at his desk after his shift at the hospital. He opened the small wooden drawer where he kept unusual case files. Nestled inside was the wallet confiscated from Everett so many years before. A wave of nostalgia and a trace of guilt washed over him. He pulled out the wallet, flipping through it to see if the contents might trigger any insight he had once missed. He froze. Tucked behind a credit card was a faded photograph. In the picture stood a young girl who looked exactly like his daughter, like she'd stepped right out of Dr. Langley's own living room. The same bright eyes, same carefree grin. The child in the photograph wore modern clothes, and behind her was furniture that matched the set in his own home, the one he now shared with Everett's grandmother. His heart pounded. Sweat beaded on his brow. He flipped the picture over. Faint handwriting read, "My daughter, age 7. Recognition lurched through his mind as he realized the impossible. This was Everett's wallet. This was his daughter's face. Somehow, the stories that the mysterious traveller had told, of coming from the future, of being the grandson of the very woman he, Dr. Langley, had married, were horrifyingly real. Cradling the photo in his trembling hands, Dr. Langley could only wonder what he had done. The mistake he had made in condemning Everett as insane was now brutally clear. And though the echoes of the past could never be undone, a new terror took hold of him, knowing his own daughter was inexorably tied to a man he had once had lobotomized, locked away in a place where memories went to die. He sat there alone in his office, haunted by the discovery and the dreadful, irresistible truth. Sometimes the past we think we know is only a thin veil, more fragile than we can ever imagine. And sometimes, in the hush of night, reality can twist in ways that leave our minds and our souls forever lost in the fog.